Welcome to the inaugural video of our mini-series exploring Slavoj Zizek's work, The Parallax View. In choosing a book that accurately reflects Zizek's thought, the selection process was not without its challenges, given the multitude of options available. While his 1989 publication, The Sublime Object of Ideology, is often hailed as his masterpiece, I ultimately decided on a more recent work, published in 2006, which provides a comprehensive and methodical exposition of his philosophy. The parallax view serves as a testament to the wide-ranging applicability of Zizek's ideas, which can be effectively applied to fields as diverse as political theory and cognitive neuroscience. In this presentation of the introduction of this work, my objective is to offer a preliminary understanding of its subject matter. Subsequently, I'll dive into certain instances of its theoretical application. Then we'll analyze the comprehensive structure of the book, inclusive of the arrangement of its topics and the rationale behind such an arrangement. And finally, I'll conclude with some comments pertaining to my methodological approach in interpreting this text. The introduction commences by presenting two anecdotes that demonstrate in distinct yet compelling ways the unexpected links between purportedly noble artistic and intellectual pursuits and the crude realm of political power. The first account pertains to the novel utilization of contemporary art as a deliberate means of inflicting suffering, engineered by the French artist and anarchist Alphonse Laurentic. The second narrative revolves around the assassination of Walter Benjamin at the hands of Stalinist operatives in retaliation for the philosopher's manuscript of a philosophical treatise purportedly perused by Stalin prior to its intended publication. These stories manifest the convergence of seemingly incompatible phenomena, namely the amalgamation of the loftiest expressions of culture, such as art and philosophy, with the most abhorrent examples of barbarism, such as torture and murder. To truly comprehend the profound interconnection between these seemingly disparate elements, it's necessary to eschew any attempt to translate culture into some polished form of savagery or to perceive barbarism as somehow a degradation or diminishment of culture. Rather, as posited by Zizek, it is through the adoption of the parallax view that a coherent understanding of this complex relationship can be achieved. In the field of optics, the concept of a visual parallax pertains to the phenomenon wherein an object's apparent position is seen to change when viewed from two distinct positions against a backdrop of other objects. To illustrate, when one extends their thumb out and successively covers a remote object while alternating between closing each eye, they will observe that the thumb appears to shift relative to the background. This effect, of course, is not due to some alteration in the thumb or the background, but rather in the viewer's change in perspective resulting from the shift in the point of observation. In Zizek's application of the notion of parallax, it involves a dynamic shift in perspective between two distinct positions while precluding any possibility of a synthesis or mediation due to an inherent chasm that is referred to as the parallax gap. The crux of the challenge is to detect and articulate this concealed gap that becomes evident through the transition of perspectives. Ultimately, this inquiry reveals that what initially appears as two diametrically opposed positions are, in fact, the internal contradiction of a single position, which gives rise to the second position. Once we can begin to comprehend this, we'll perceive the thematic coherence that pervades the entire work. Initially, one may see this approach as a revival of Kant's antinomies in opposition to Hegelian dialectics, which conventionally is understood as demonstrating how two opposing viewpoints are reconciled or subsumed into a superior synthesis, a third position. Nonetheless, a central contention posited by Zizek is that the notion of parallax empowers us to retrieve Hegelian dialectics from this erroneous construal. Zizek posits another intriguing proposition that the parallax view can also lead to a renewal of dialectical materialism. He challenges the conventional notion regarding the relationship between dialectical materialism and historical materialism. Historical materialism is a social theory conceptualized by Marx and Engels, which explains the evolution of society and historical progress as a result of material conditions and social relations. It postulates that economic and material factors drive socio-cultural political change. On the other hand, dialectical materialism is a philosophical approach that perceives conflict and contradiction within social, economic, and political structures as the impetus for development and transformation. The former, historical materialism, emphasizes specific historical circumstances, while the latter represents a universal ontological viewpoint. Now, in contrast to this manner of distinguishing the two, the parallax view allows us to consider this difference between the universal and the particular as a difference internal to the particular itself. In other words, dialectical materialism and historical materialism are substantially the same, and that the shift from one to the other is, in a sense, a matter of perspective. But there is a real gap here, a gap produced between them, one that is situated within historical materialism, which imbibes in a kind of reflexive difference toward itself, thereby giving rise to this second position, this broader philosophical position of dialectical materialism. This case exemplifies the kind of movement of thought one discovers throughout this work. As we move through the text, we'll consistently contemplate different dichotomies with respect to this progression that involves a differentiation inherent to a single position. Such an approach would, to a certain extent, aid in overcoming the dualisms of thought, while refraining from succumbing to the snares of a third synthesizing position, or adhering to the idea of an absolute differentiation with a multiplicity of irreconcilable viewpoints. A second and related example is the parallax gap between the social and the individual that we discover in psychoanalysis. The pertinent question that arises here is whether it is indeed feasible to extrapolate the insights gained from psychoanalysis, a methodology devised primarily for healing the mental afflictions of individuals, to the broader context of collective entities. Yet, this formulation of the problem becomes inadequate once we consider that the gap between individual and social is in fact inscribed within the individual. The social field, with its practices and beliefs, is an internal relationship with an external objective order, which exists only insofar as individuals relate to it as something existing. Just like how money only functions as money because people believe in its value and not because it has some intrinsic value independent of such belief. And even if you consider yourself someone enlightened and who sees through the artificiality and insubstantiality of money, that you are not a believer in the inherent value of money, your private distancing from such belief is itself predicated upon those so-called naive others who unreflectively truly believe in the value of money. And it's sufficient for others to believe on your behalf for money to continue to function for you as if it truly had some intrinsic value, just as it's sufficient that your children believe in Santa Claus for you to act as if he is truly existing, despite no professed belief in him. A third example of the parallax addressed in this intro is the relationship between thought and being, stated otherwise as mind and materiality, or subjectivity and objectivity. The duality perhaps represents the quintessential modern philosophical problem. Historical and dialectical materialism address this relationship in different ways. For historical materialism, thought or consciousness is conceived of as a critical active moment in social reality or social being. It's a kind of becoming conscious of one's concrete social position, And this active moment in turn changes social reality, such as when the passive working class is transformed into the proletariat as revolutionary subject. For dialectical materialism, the consideration of the relation between thought and being is not so much focused on the overcoming of the gap that separates them, but instead in how the gap between thought and being emerges in the first place. In other words, it inquires into how it is the case that from the flat order of positive being, a living organism within that order can, in a sense, withdraw from it and acquire a reflexive stance toward its own being, giving rise to this gap between thought and being. What is particularly notable in this third example is how Zizek takes up our first case of the parallax, that being between historical materialism and dialectical materialism, and now uses it to think through another parallax, that being between thought and being. This is one of the wonderfully integrated and yet maddeningly complex features of Zizek's thinking on display, wherein we're not merely dealing with a linear series of independent parallaxes, but much more of a nested set of intersecting ones. Throughout this work, Zizek attempts to overcome the confused polarity of opposites through the notion of a parallax gap which separates one position from itself. He'll show how it is that many fields have their own expression of this parallax, from quantum physics with its wave-particle duality to neurobiology with its hard problem of consciousness. And once again, psychoanalysis, wherein we find through Lacan several parallaxes, including that between objet A and the actual concrete object, the real as positive unmoved being and real as insubstantial nothing, and the gap between desire and drive. Finally, we can turn to philosophy itself, which can be thought of as a historically extended debate concerning the parallax, from Plato's distinction between appearance and reality to Descartes' mind-body dualism, all the way to Heidegger's notion of ontological difference. However, another more critical point Zizek raises concerning philosophy is not merely with regards to how philosophy relates to impositions concepts relative to one another, such as Plato's appearance-reality distinction, but more fundamentally how the practice of philosophy, as the essentially reflective act of thought, emerges out of substantial social realities, but wherein the philosopher is unable or unwilling to identify their thought with any kind of positive social identity. The reason for this is quite interesting in that, according to Zizek, philosophy emerges not merely out of some specific communal identity, but more precisely in the gaps between different social communities, within what he says, the fragile space of exchange and circulation between them, a space which lacks any positive identity. This disintegration of a substantial social identity goes hand in hand with, for example, the emergence of the insubstantial character of Descartes' cogito, which, like Lacan's split subject, serves as an empty place or pure structural function. The case for such an argument is even stronger for Spinoza, who himself spoke from the position of the double outcast, being excommunicated by his Jewish community that itself was an outcast within Western society. As such, Spinoza is for Zizek paradigmatic of a communal out-of-jointness, so to speak, that often, if not always, characterizes the great philosopher. An implication of this is that while attempting to dwell in the universality of reason, philosophers also have at their disposal a non-philosophical and private use of reason, one reflective of their ethnic roots and identities, however fragmented they may be. According to Zizek, one need not be ashamed of this heritage, that in fact one can love and be proud of it, while at the same time recognizing that these roots ultimately remain irrelevant to the category of truth. Here he'll evoke St. Paul, who, though proud of being Jew and Roman citizen, nonetheless spoke from a place of universal truth that was neither Jew nor Greek. The logic he engages in is not one that pits one ethnic group against another, but instead concerns the antagonisms that cut diagonally across all particular groups. And this will be a theme running throughout this book, culminating in the final chapter where we find what amounts to a kind of positive political program proposed by Zizek. We find that in this movement of thought a notable contrast with a predominant contemporary mode of philosophizing that affirms multiplicity over universality, and that claims reason is the expression of purely situated, particular, but also fragmented identities. Consequently, positing any such notion of the transcendental or universal would, from that perspective of multiplicity, amount to a violent imposition. However, what we discover here is yet another parallax, this time between the universal and the multiple, or the general and the particular, the insubstantial and the concrete. In response to this parallax, Zizek turns to Kant, who he interprets as presenting a paradoxical kind of universal singularity of a subject who, through a kind of short circuit, bypasses the mediation of particular identities to directly participate and identify with the universal. To identify with the universal here is to identify with a universal ethical political principle that is accessible to all. This gives meaning to Kant's distinction between the private and public spheres. The private entails the communal institutional order of one's particular identifications. The public entails the transnational universality expressed in the exercise of reason. According to Zizek's read here, one only participates in this public sphere as a singular individual extracted from any substantial communal identifications. More precisely, one participates from within the gaps of communal identities rather than from an entrenchment in any particular communal identity, and rather than from some kind of abstract position that pretends itself to be completely absent of any particularity, completely above all specificity, as is the case for the early modern conception of reason. Thus, the way in which one identifies with the position of universality, to the degree we take up the position of the outcast, the excess remainder, the not all, that cannot be totalized by any particular symbolic system, wherein we can access universality that cuts across all identities. That is, that every particular social community identity contains within itself its own outcasts. And what he's suggesting is a universality that cuts across every group to, in a sense, find the universal truth that binds the outcasts of different communities, which will in turn, I think, be a way of exploiting the revolutionary potential inherent within those communities. And so what we've seen demonstrated here in the introduction of the parallax view is exemplary for what follows. The book itself is divided into 3 sections, organized thematically in terms of the antagonisms within philosophy, science, and politics. Each topic corresponding with the triad of universal, particular, and singular, and each being brought into relation with some kind of objective material reality. Philosophy's antagonism will concern the gap between universal ontology and objective ontic beings. The antagonism of science focuses on the gap between particular phenomenal self-experience and objective brain processes. Finally, political antagonisms will concern the gap between the singularity of class struggle and objective socio-economic forces. In each case, Zizek aims to search beneath the ostensible dualism to discover what he calls the minimal difference that generated the duality in the first place. This notion of a minimal difference is a central term, and it seems fairly close to, if not synonymous with, the notion of a parallax gap, except it emphasizes its active component, wherein we see how the slightest and nearly imperceptible shift is sufficient to bring about radical change, whether in terms of the perspective being applied or to the system that embodies such antagonisms. While initially intending to employ a concept-by-concept analysis similar to that used in my examination of Anti-Oedipus, I soon realized that such an approach was not feasible in comprehensively organizing Zizek's concepts. This may be attributed to both my own limitations, but also perhaps the idiosyncratic nature of Zizek's own thinking, which seamlessly weaves in and out of arguments, unexpectedly revisiting earlier lines of reasoning and delving into seemingly tangential ideas, which in reality are often more closely related than they first appear. Despite my best efforts, I could not identify a more systematic way of organizing Zizek's concepts beyond the order in which they're already presented by Zizek himself. Another challenge encountered when reading and comprehending Zizek's work is his tendency to initially present another philosopher's ideas in a seemingly positive light, only to subsequently shift into a critique in a sudden and unexpected manner. And it takes sometimes multiple readings and careful cross-referencing to grasp what exactly is being argued in a given section, whether this is the view that Zizek is espousing or whether it's the view of another thinker he's espousing that he's about to set up for a critique. As such, you can take a passage out of context and easily be led to a distorted interpretation of Zizek's own stance, causing him to appear to support all sorts of positions that he actually disagrees with. While this is not unique to Zizek's writing, it appears to be particularly prevalent in his work, making it a challenge to summarize the central ideas without reference to the surrounding arguments. Consequently, to address this issue, I tend to systematically work through the text, dedicating about a video to each chapter, beginning with this introductory section, and ultimately creating somewhere around 7 to 8 videos total. As is always my intention, I try to understand and then present the text while seeking to bracket any criticisms and disagreements I may have with the ideas presented for the sake of attempting the most accurate or at least most charitable presentation of the content. Critique is good, necessary, and indeed often unavoidable. It's not opposed to reading well and in fact opens up new ways of reading the text. However, as a first step, I believe it's incumbent upon the reader to treat the text as its own authority for what it says prior to imposing a foreign philosophical language that somehow demonstrates any supposed inadequacies. Of course, this is an aspirational aim, one only imperfectly achieved. Finally, the way to get the most out of these videos will be to watch them in conjunction with reading the text. I do hope that one can get some important ideas out of the videos alone, but there will also be a lot missed and not understood since my presentation of the material is grounded in the text itself. So think of these videos as a supplement rather than a replacement to reading. Reading the Parallax view will also allow you to identify holes and inadequacies in my own presentation in a much more informed and precise manner that can allow for some meaningful engagement and further conversation. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. I'm looking forward to this. It's been a long time coming, and it was in fact Zizek that introduced me to Lacan, so it's nice to go back to revisit Zizek, having done so much work in Lacan. So we'll see what comes of all this. And as always, thank you for watching. And until next time, be well.